Welcome. Today I'll be talking about high-resolution agroforestry mapping in the central United States. The primary focus of this work is on windbreaks, which are prevalent in this region. And so when we think about these windbreak resources, we know they serve important functions on the landscape, but there's little information about their location, extent, and condition available. Anecdotal evidence suggests there's widespread removal, yet there's no way to determine this on a large scale. So my goal today is to tell you a little bit of the story about these windbreaks and these trees in the Great Plains region. Not only are they important ecologically, but they also have what I think is kind of an interesting history as they relate to this region. So when we think of this area in the United States, the Great Plains, which I typically refer to as, we think of a flat, treeless landscape dominated by monoculture cropping systems. We think of extreme weather, flooding, droughts, wind, which is all correct. The Great Plains region is typically defined by the area outlined on this map. And so while I talk about central US, the Great Plains, the central plains states, the focus of the work that we've been doing is in the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, and Nebraska. So setting the stage a bit, most of us are familiar with the story of the Dust Bowl years in the early 20th century. A series of wet years and rising wheat prices led to intensive cultivation of increasingly marginal lands. With the onset of drought starting in 1931, the overplowed farmland began to blow away. Massive dust storms and economic devastation ensued. And this stands as the worst and most prolonged natural disaster, as well as the largest mass migration of people in American history. So we can read from The Worst Hard Time by Tim Egan about Black Sunday, which was in April of 1935. He says the storm carried twice as much dirt as was dug out of to create the Panama Canal. The canal took 7 years to dig. The storm lasted a single afternoon. More than 300,000 tons of Great Plains topsoil was airborne that day. So in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt started a series of New Deal programs to lift the country out of the Great Depression. One of those, in response to this severe erosion problem, was the Prairie States Forestry Project, which was targeted at two major challenges: unemployment and wind erosion. From 1935 to 1942, the Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration planted more than 200 million trees across 6 states. Over 30,000 windbreaks were planted, which equated to over 18,000 linear miles. This is a photo of Raphael Zahn, who was the technical coordinator for the project and was also the first head of research for the U.S. Forest Service. So we can look at the landscape now with easy accessibility of aerial photography, and we can start to see some trends. If we look further at what's going on the landscape, it appears that windbreak removal is increasing over the past several decades. This series of aerial photos shows a time period of 3 years from 2009 to 2012, and we can see 33 acres of tree loss as in this small example. This is another time period from 2006 to 2016. And you can see the dramatic effect that center pivot irrigation has played on these windbreaks. Most often, the windbreak is partially removed, leaving the L-shaped patterns in the corners of the field. This time period is also significant due to some major events related to agricultural production. The implementation of biofuel standards led to more interest in planting corn. The price of corn was high during this period, and there was also a pretty dramatic increase in agricultural land values. So there's definitely some external forces going on that contributes to the loss of windbreaks. So we talked about the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s, and yet this is still an issue, though not as widespread. Here's a few media clippings and magazine articles talking about this issue within the past couple of years. You can see the article headline in the top middle there that talks about debate continuing on how to slow wind and limit erosion. And then a couple of articles with some catchy headlines such as Dust Bowl days are here again and we are barreling towards another Dust Bowl. A paper just came out last week from an AGU publication that talks about increasing dust from cropland expansion and the impacts from climate change that could lead to increased risk of desertification in the Great Plains. Here's a few more recent articles touching on the subject of tree removal and indicating that these resources are under threat. So while I don't want to claim cause and effect, if you look at the articles and you read the comments about them, people are definitely having those conversations. It's one piece of the puzzle. From the historical records of the Nebraska State Forest Service, you can see a comment here talking about the future residents of Nebraska will be very happy that someone was farsighted enough to construct these shelter belts. Well, in 2017, Nebraska's first historical windbreak was brought down by a new landowner. The photo here of the historical marker next to the pile of trees is striking. The historical marker was later removed by the county, but it elicited a fairly strong response from certain circles and from the locals. And so from an inventory perspective, we ask, do these anecdotes add up to any trends? What's really going on out there? And it turns out we don't have any good information about these trees to declare any factual statements about any trends, really. We hear a lot about windbreak removal and we see it with our own eyes, but we need to be more systematic about our assumptions. So moving on, I've pointed out some instances where inventory of trees outside forests in these agricultural areas may be useful, but we need the data. The recently updated USDA Agroforestry Strategic Framework calls for advances in agroforestry by establishing measurement, inventorying, and monitoring protocols that more accurately reflect agroforestry plantings and their impacts. So there's always been a question surrounding agroforestry of how much is out there. While there has been some work done in the past, no large-scale coordinated inventory has been done. Neither the Forest Service or other natural resource inventories capture these trees outside forests. The lack of accurate inventory hinders the ability to estimate and project the magnitude of ecosystem services that these resources provide. A key finding in this USDA report from 2016, titled Assessing the Sustainability of Agricultural and Urban Forests in the United States, says that inventory and reporting activities are sorely lacking in agricultural and urban forests at the national level. A key finding from the publication on the left from 2005 details these inventory gaps and estimates the proportion of trees that are missed by current inventories. So some of the questions that are being asked is, how much is out there? Where is it? What is it doing and how is it changing? This map shows estimates of the trees that are currently being missed according to FIA definitions. As you probably know, FIA is the Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis. And their sample-based approach to inventory is not designed for the types of tree cover in this part of the country, and it just doesn't pick up these resources very well. So you can see that over 50% is potentially being missed in some of these states and upwards of 70% in North Dakota. So besides knowing how much is out there, knowing where it is and the function of these trees is very useful information too. And sample-based approaches to inventory, they just don't tell that complete story. So this is where our project comes in. Team Toffee, which is the Trees Outside Forests image-based inventory, was created with support from the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station FIA unit and the USDA National Agroforestry Center. And we have two phases to the project. Phase one was to develop the methods to map these trees. And phase two was to identify and quantify the ecosystem functions that these trees provide. So we want to create a baseline inventory that can be monitored over time, as well as fill in the gaps of current inventories to extend accounting of these trees to all lands. This publication from 2012 describes some of the methods that were determined to be effective for our mapping efforts. So when we talk about trees outside forests, we define that based on the definition of forest land by the FIA. The area must meet any of these criteria to be considered forest land. Greater than 10% canopy cover, 1 acre in area, or 120 feet wide. Many of the working trees in agricultural areas just don't meet this criteria, so they're not being picked up. So some of the methods that we're using to do this mapping of tree cover at high resolution is using an image-based approach to mapping these trees. It's an object-based image analysis, which simulates groups of objects on the landscape based on our 1 meter aerial photography that we're using. So we use some training data, and then we use algorithms to identify these features on the road, such as buildings, trees, water, and so on. And so the resulting output is a high resolution GIS data set, which is 1 meter in resolution. We do not do any tree species information, and we also are not doing any urban areas. We're using a software called eCognition to segment the imagery into image objects, or basically polygons, which it identifies as unique features. We use some training data paired with some custom tools in ArcMap with an R script running random forest computer learning algorithm. We use nape imagery as our base layer. These data sets are publicly available, frequently flown, and are wall-to-wall coverage for a state. The nape images also include a near-infrared band, which helps identify features. So this is kind of what that process looks like, going from the raw image of the 1 meter aerial photography to our final output, which is a TIFF raster. And so you can see the yellow lines on the middle photo are outlining the tree cover there. And the final output, the green is the tree cover, and the yellow is other land cover. This is what the final product looks like for Kansas and Nebraska. For Kansas, we used 2015 nape imagery, and we used 2014 for Nebraska. Our estimates show approximately 600,000 acres of trees outside forests additional that were picked up additionally for Nebraska, and over 1.3 million acres for Kansas. So as I mentioned before, the second phase was using this data to determine tree function using some shape metrics. So we know riparian areas and windbreaks have a very distinct shape. So can we identify those features based on shape alone on a large scale? And without knowing the details of this graph from our paper we published in 2017, we did in fact determine you could classify these groups of trees based on their shape using what we call a straight and narrow index feature. So the windbreaks were broken out from riparian, and the windbreaks were further classified by direction, such as north, south, east, west, as well as L-shaped windbreaks. So based on some initial results using our shape-based methods to quantify windbreaks only, this map shows those windbreaks in Kansas. And again, these are some early estimates, but they show about 30,000 linear miles of windbreaks in Kansas in 2015. This is what that looks like zoomed in a little bit further. And again, we're not only measuring how much is out there, but we can show where these windbreaks are. So we can see the linear mileage for the counties in the state. And being able to quantify the area protected by windbreaks, it would be a very useful metric. And based on these results and using some rudimentary assumptions, we estimate there could be as much as 900,000 acres protected by windbreaks in Kansas. Again, we could add in some other data layers like cropland data to get more information about what is being protected. How much of the windbreaks are protecting farmsteads versus fields, or pasture would be another example of something that we could determine. So we've got our initial data sets completed for Kansas and Nebraska. What are some of the next steps? We're hoping to release some additional data sets. We have a second year for Nebraska that is about 75% done, and North Dakota and South Dakota are nearing completion and under review for their statewide maps. We also realize we need to do some more robust estimation in order for this data to truly be considered for inventory inclusion. What we're doing, just adding up pixels, probably isn't going to cut it. So possibly incorporating some field data being done by partners could be a part of this to expand this data with further information. We'd also like to use this data for some value-added analysis using other data layers. As I mentioned, the cropland data layer, which is an annual medium resolution data set produced annually by NASS. We think this data could be useful for people doing a wide array of issues dealing with water quality, wildlife, pollinators, and other natural resource concerns. We're also starting a study later this year where we're hopefully going to be using this data to scale up some carbon sequestration modeling. We'd also like to see a shift toward being a consumer of other people's high-resolution land cover data set instead of producing the data ourselves. With more private sector data coming online, that could be purchased or possibly free as it becomes more common, not having to create the data ourselves would certainly lend itself for us to do more work with the data instead of having to create it. I just saw an article a couple of weeks ago that talks about satellites could soon map every tree on Earth. So I think we're getting close to having access to more of this land cover data set at a higher resolution than is currently available. We've also talked about pushing our mapping out to the cloud, which could be more efficient, and we've explored using cloud-based technology such as Google Earth Engine. So here's a couple of examples of applications the data set could be used for. The first one is an example being done currently by the Kansas Forest Service. It's using this data set with some additional data such as windbreak condition to reach out to landowners and let them know about possible cost share or other conservation programs available for windbreak renovation. Another example, talking about riparian buffer gaps, we could use this data to identify riparian zone gaps for water quality or wildlife concerns. So you could prioritize these gaps in existing tree cover to target conservation efforts. Some of the output products that have come out of this, the data is available for download on the Forest Service Research Data Archive. It's downloadable by county for Nebraska and Kansas, and it is a 4-bit TIFF raster file. This data is also available on data.gov, and it is in the Forest Service's raster data house, a raster data warehouse for Forest Service employees. They can pull this data directly into their mapping software. We've also created a couple of story maps, which are a great way to engage folks about this project, and I'll talk about those in a second. These are just a few articles or other media that have come out about the project. The AP picked up an article about the work from the Bismarck Tribune in 2017, and so it was popping up in a few newspapers around the country. Story maps that we've created, this one is named Making Trees Outside Forests Count, and it's just kind of an overview of the TOFI work, and includes some examples of how the data is being used and some nice interactive maps that highlight the data. Another story map focused more on windbreaks only, called Windbreaks of the Great Plains, was recently released, and it kind of tells the story of these trees. There's some great historical photos from the archives of the Prairie State Forestry Project, which we have at the National Agroforestry Center. It talks about kind of how windbreaks work, as well as a mapping section where you can explore some of the historical data as well as the newer data that we recently released. We also have a interactive web mapping application where you can explore the data. So instead of having to download the GIS data sets, and for people who maybe are not as GIS savvy, they could use this site to kind of see what the data looks like, view areas of interest. We also have some other data sets that we've incorporated, such as that NASS cropland layer and some soils data. So this is kind of what that looks like. And we will add North Dakota and South Dakota to this as they come online. This is our website with all the relevant information about the project, links to data sets, status updates, and that sort of thing. This is housed at the Northern Research Station website. And working with partners has been crucial to get this work done. We've worked with state forestry agencies in these states, and also the partner, the TOFI team that has made much of this work possible. Dacia Meneguzzo is the PI for this work at the Northern Research Station FIA unit. Greg Lickness is also there, and myself with my contact information there at the bottom. Thank you.